Okay, this is gonna be a little segment about where were you when, and obviously you know the subject and the date. Okay, I'm gonna have to explain to you a little bit about my segment for that day, my arrangements. Our family had two cars. One was a 1998 Infiniti i30, and one was a 1999 Jeep Cherokee Sport. And the Jeep needed to have its inspection renewed. Now, I had two classes in the afternoon. I was attending community college for a drafting degree. My mother worked, as she does, for the city as a civilian. My father was retired. The best way to make the arrangements was for my father and mother in the morning to drive both cars to the mechanic, drop the Jeep off at the mechanic for the inspection. My mother and father would then drive in the Infiniti to my mother's office. My father would drop her off. My father would come back home, pick me up, bring me to class, and then come back and do my mother later. They would get the Jeep from the mechanic together later, pick me up later. It was also a primary election on that day. It was a Tuesday. That was canceled by the governor's office and postponed to a later date. So there's no voting that day, obviously. My father, my mother got in the cars, drove to the mechanic, dropped off the Jeep. They went to my mother's office, dropped her off, and my mother called me. My mother said to me that a plane flew into the World Trade Center. Now, obviously, my language is not always polite, and my reaction to that was, how fucking stupid do you have to be to fly a plane into a building that is that large? You couldn't fly over it? You were that low to the ground? What an idiot. And I'm thinking, what does plane mean? Does plane mean two-seater plane like in the Buddy Holly Richie Valens plane? Does plane mean jumbo jet? What does plane mean? And I was watching the building on fire, and then I thought to myself, have you ever seen the movie, and it's a great movie, The Towering Inferno? The Towering Inferno was a fictitious movie starring Steve McQueen and Paul Newman. Paul Newman is an architect who designs the largest building in the world. William Holden is the construction manager who cuts corners and makes the plane as unsafe as can be. When the building catches fire on opening night, Steve McQueen is the fire chief who responds. And Steve McQueen said to Paul Newman, you know there's no sure way for us to fight anything over the 7th floor, but you just keep building them higher. That's exactly what I thought. And my exact words to myself were, how in the hell is the fire department in New York City going to go up that high and put out that fire? How are they going to do it? And then my father was outside. I had to go down to meet him to get to class. I don't know why I went to class that day. I didn't go to class the next day. I stayed home the next day. And we're in the car, and when we're in the car going up, the second plane hit. Now, obviously, when the second plane hit, we knew it was deliberate. There's no way in hell two people could have an accident like that within a half hour of one another. Less than that. There was no way. It had to be deliberate action. And rumors were already going around that Bin Laden was somehow involved. I went up to the campus, and I was waiting outside of the classroom. And a guy came by and said, the Pentagon has been hit. And I literally thought I was in the middle of a fucking movie. And I was mortified. I didn't know what to do, what to think. Our cell phones did not work, so we had to use payphones to call home. I used the payphone to call my mother, and my mother said the towers are gone. They're just gone. They collapsed. Now, I am an idiot sometimes, and I do not always think. But when I got home, I remembered something very important. My cousin and our uncle were in the second building, with the second building that was hit. Now, my first cousin, his name is Mike. His father and my father are brothers. He's my first cousin. Our uncle by marriage, our uncle that married into our family, Uncle Richie, was with him in his office. They have an office together, or they had it at the time, obviously, in the building where the second plane hit. The second building to be hit, excuse me. The first plane hit the first building. They felt an earthquake. And they dust, smoke, fire. You get the picture. I'm not going to get graphic about it any more than I have to explain it. And I'm bending over here like an idiot, so that's why I'm huffing and puffing. The minute they felt that earthquake, they ran out of the building. And that story, there was a story after September 11th about a lot of employers were telling their employee, come back to work, come back, sit down, what the fuck? That was true. There really were employers and telling their employees to get back to work. My cousin and my uncle would rather be on unemployment than be dead. So their asses ran down the building, and when they got to the ground floor, the second plane hit their building on the floor where they had been moments ago. And my cousin had a secretary who was attending a meeting up on the top. She did not come down. Emerald Lagasse, I think it was Emerald Lagasse, had a restaurant on the top floor of one of the buildings, but he had a dentist appointment in the lower floor, and he survived, but many of his employees did not. It was a very, very tragic day. If this plane hit first, if that plane hit first, it was very, very tragic. Now, I had a lot of people I knew that were down in that area, you know, cousins, this and that, but they made it out. I had friends that lost relatives, I had relatives that lost friends. But I do not personally know anyone that died. But I feel horrible for their families. Now, in the recent years, have you ever watched the memorial services, which I look at it for a couple of seconds and I turn it off. Every memorial, I envision, what if my cousin didn't make it? And I see my Aunt Kathy and my Uncle Frank, his parents, reading his name. He didn't die, and that didn't happen, but every year I close my eyes and I imagine it happening. I also imagine my Aunt Sheila and her two sons reading my Uncle Richie's name. Now, a few days after the attacks, this is going to get a little graphic now, but a few days after the attacks, we had to close our windows. I live in Yonkers, New York. I do not live in New York City. But the smell had come over to where I lived, and you could literally smell death outside of outside of our windows. It was a putrid smell. A cousin of mine was a police officer in New Jersey. He volunteered his time to go down there a few times. And one time we were standing in front of our church. He was telling me and a friend of his. He pointed to the ground outside of our church. And he said, from here, and then he pointed out towards Sacred Heart Basilica. This is in Newark, New Jersey. He said, from here to there, well over a quarter mile, nothing but debris and the smell of death. Now, a few weeks after the tragedy, I was in New Jersey with my extended family. It was me, my mother, my father. Excuse me. Live TV. Me, my mother, my father, my sister, my brother-in-law, and her two girls. Her son wasn't born yet. We're having lunch in a restaurant, and my Uncle Richie and my Aunt Sheila came in out of the blue. And my uncle came over to where I was sitting to hug me, and I gave him a hug, and I whispered in his ear, we're glad you're back. He has post-traumatic stress disorder up the ass. He's deathly afraid of planes. He's deathly afraid to get on planes. He went to church every single day for, I couldn't even begin to tell you how many years. He probably still goes to church every single day. You know, our parents, actually my older siblings too, had the Kennedy assassination. Our grandparents and my father was 6, had Pearl Harbor. We have September 11th. It is a day that I just do not want to relive that day. I was not personally touched by it, but my family members were traumatized by it. My family members were there. It makes you really, really appreciate what you have in life, and just, you know, what life really means, what life really about, and it just really is. So that's where I was on September 11th. Oh, also, footnote. Remember I mentioned The Towering Inferno? The Towering Inferno was a movie, I mentioned it a few minutes ago, about a fire breaking out in the world's tallest building. Completely fiction. The day The Towering Inferno opened in theaters was September 11th, 1974. And that day, there was a fire in the World Trade Center. How's that for fucking scary? Okay, I'm gonna cut now. Thank you. Today is not September 11th. Today is September 8th. But I have time to do this now. I'm doing it now. Thank you.